Hello, and welcome to today's Environment and Energy Leader webinar sponsored by Montrose Environmental Group, an environmental services company. My name is Jessica Hunt, and on behalf of the entire team at E+ELeader, we welcome you to Moving Beyond Checklists, from ESG to EHS, the essentials for establishing, designing, and executing audit programs. During this webinar, you will have the opportunity to hear from subject matter experts as we explore auditing and the whole process and highlight essentials to consider when executing individual audits, as well as establishing and implementing an audit program. During today's event, please submit all questions for our presenters using the Q&A widget, which is already open on your screen. The attendee chat widget is for you to converse with other attendees, let us know where you are joining from and why you decided to jump on with us today. If for some reason you are having any technical difficulties during today's event, please follow the troubleshooting tips located in the help widget at the bottom of your console. If you are still having issues after performing those steps, please feel free to give me, send a message to me using your Q&A widget. Additionally, please take note of the resources in the resources tab, as well as the 2 call to action buttons. And E+ELeader, this is something new for 2023. We will be providing a certificate of attendance for all attendees for meeting the specific viewing criteria. And at this point, I am extremely pleased to welcome Jamie Patrick, Dr. Michael Green, and Sean Gilday. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Jamie and rejoin everybody for the Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessica. And hi, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. My name is Jamie Patrick. And as Jessica said, I'm with Montrose Environmental. I've been with Montrose for about 6 months now as their Vice President of Sustainability Advisory. I'm joined by Mike and Sean, who will introduce themselves in a minute, but let me just set the stage for us a little bit before we deep dive into our topic at hand. For those of you who don't know who Montrose Environmental is, just a really quick background. Montrose has its roots really in traditional environmental services, stack testing, LDAR, labs, but over the years, we've really strived to become kind of a full service environmental and sustainability consultant for our clients. So you'll see here we have a range of services that we really try to integrate in order to meet our clients' needs under the One Montrose way. Interestingly for me, my background today, coming in as the Vice President of Sustainability Advisory, I do focus mostly on corporate sustainability and climate change needs of our clients. But my background is really anchored in traditional EHS compliance and auditing. So I'm really pleased to be able to facilitate a discussion today that talks about how we move beyond checklists, and from both the EHS and the ESG perspective, we're looking at audit programs that really drive performance and manage risk. So a little bit about the advisory services part of Montrose. As I noted, beyond some of our traditional services, the Environmental Advisory Services Group really looks to work at a strategic level with our clients, understanding their biggest environmental or broader ESG or sustainability challenges, and working with our clients innovatively and with digital solutions in order to determine best fit paths forward. We know that the organizations you're working with and many of our clients are setting very ambitious goals and targets these days around all sorts of E, S, and G issues. So a lot of what we do is work with our clients to understand how those goals and targets can be achieved by implementing programs and plans in-house, and then monitoring the success of those programs, tracking actions, and yes, checking performance through things like auditing to make sure that your organization is on track for meeting its commitments, whether those are traditional EHS or more broad ESG. So on that note, I would guess that many folks on the call are very familiar with the concepts of auditing, and likely more in the environmental health and safety space, where regulatory compliance audits are very common, as well as EHS management systems audits. Today, we really want to talk about how those solid principles around auditing can also be broadened out to look at the ESG programs and ESG commitments that organizations like yours are likely making. First and foremost, E, S, and G, E, environment, EHS, E, environment. So there's already by design a lot of overlap in the programs that organizations have put in place to both ensure environmental compliance, manage environmental risk, but also drive environmental performance improvement. And that's a lot of the area where the E moves from compliance to more of that ESG realm and being able to achieve certain performance commitments. So, much like an EHS focused audit, an ESG program audit can really play a critical role applying that same plan, do, check, act cycle to understand how performance is tracking against objectives and expectations, and identify areas for performance improvement and continual improvement along the way. So in this regard, we're going to talk a lot today about audit programs. I would just challenge the audience to, listen through both of these lenses, both the more traditional EHS lens, as well as the more kind of future-focused ESG lens, and think about how these principles that Mike and Sean are going to talk to you about today can really be used to drive both broad performance improvements, as well as regulatory compliance and risk management. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to our two audit subject matter experts, Sean and Mike. And Sean, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Jamie. Good afternoon. My name is Sean Gilday. I am a senior advisor at Environmental Standards and the EHS principal in Montrose's Environmental Advisory Services Group. In case you're curious about the two different logos, Environmental Standards was purchased by Montrose about a year ago, so we are still integrating. I have been working in the EHS auditing, compliance, and management system space as a consultant for the last 19 years. I have my CPEA, which is a certified professional environmental auditor credential, and also my project management professional certification, or PMP. Over my career, I have led and directed a number of international and domestic audit programs across a wide swath of clients, from chemical manufacturers and railroads to automotive manufacturers and food and beverage clients. Thank you for allowing me to participate here today. Mike?
Thank you, Sean. My background, I'm a PhD inorganic chemist. I have an MBA from the University of Chicago. I'm also a certified professional environmental auditor. I've got about 35 years of industry experience and 25 years global audit experience. I am a responsible care ISO 14001 and ISO 50001 lead auditor. I served as an HSE manager, done a lot of roles in audit programs. I think I've served in every particular role that there is in an audit program, as well as on an audit. I had the opportunity to serve on the IIA EHS Audit Center Advisory Board. And like Sean, we've had the opportunity to work together serving a wide variety of industries. I want to continue on the theme that Jamie had talked about in the comparing EHS and ESG. EHS auditing has been around for many years. The topics are well defined and understood by many. ESG, in contrast, is a more recent development and is still new to many, particularly the social and governance aspects. Unfortunately, if you've been paying attention to the news, ESG is currently caught up in a number of political issues, which can do generally more harm than good, particularly when agreed standards are changed without consensus, when standards are applied when they've not been agreed as applicable, and when recommendations are treated more as requirements. Auditors must be mindful of this and keep focused on audit fundamentals when performing their work. In the following discussion, I will lay out some of these fundamentals. On this slide, we'll cover what we're going to discuss today, and we're going to talk about audit processes. both from a program level as well as the individual audit. In looking at audit programs, we'll talk about key factors to consider when you establish an audit program and when you update it. And we'll talk about some of the best practices around audit frequency, quality assurance, verification, and reporting to senior management. For individual audits, we'll cover criteria, scope, protocol, findings definition, root cause analysis, corrective and preventive actions and reporting. And lastly, we'll touch on periodic audit program reviews, which are really designed to ensure continued efficiency and effectiveness of an audit program, as well as to verify its intended purpose and design. So let's start out with some basic definitions. An audit program is a planned, documented, systematic, and objective approach for executing audits across the set of in-scope business activities for the program stakeholders, with the objective of enabling risk reduction and driving performance improvement within those business activities. An individual audit, in contrast, is a planned, documented, systematic, and objective approach to examine the topics, facilities, and time period outlined within the audit scope, with the objective of identifying gaps that, when closed, will reduce risk and drive performance. When we consider audit programs, if you're just starting out, it's a bit like building a house. You need to start with a good foundation, and then there are simply a whole lot of decisions you need to make. And so one of them is simply, if you're going to do an audit program, why do you want to do it? What is your purpose? What are you trying to achieve? What are the deliverables of the audit program? And importantly, who are the customers? Often these are referred to as stakeholders. You have to consider the scope, what's in and what's out, right? So in the scope, usually talking about requirements, you're talking about facilities and a time frame. Some basics to think about, always a divide and conquer approach is good. If you're doing it at a corporate level, what level are the audits to be performed at? For example, are they done on a business group level? Are they done at a business level? Are they done at the site level? Is it an area? Is it a unit? Is it a topic? Or is it a program, right? Audits can be done at kind of any level, but you need to think about that within the context of the program in order to set it up. You need to think about who will do the audits, how will they do the audit, and importantly, when do these audits get conducted? As you complete audits, you want to start thinking about how you need to analyze the information that your program is collecting. And then one of the things to also think about, and I don't think a lot of programs really do this very well, it's how expansive can your program draft corrective actions? For example, if you're auditing across a set of facilities and you see in the first several that you're finding a similar finding at each one, can you actually draft a corrective action that goes out to the other facilities before you even audit them, that addresses this? As an auditor, one of the things that I've always been frustrated by the years is that not a lot of programs address that. And so I have to write the same finding again and again if I'm doing a set of audits. I'd much rather see that a company took the proactive step of correcting a problem that they know exists before we get there. When we look at requirements in a little bit more detail, again, we want these agreed within the audit program and with the audited entity prior to the on-site audit. But you could have audited entity requirements, which are corporate standards, facility standard operating procedures, client specified standards. So this could include ESG program standards. You could have industry codes of practice or framework, for example, in the chemical industry, responsible care, international standards, ISO 9000, 14000, 45000, or 50000. You could have the regulatory requirements, OSHA, EPA, U.S. Coast Guard, DHS, DOT. You could have legal requirements, such as consent decrees or court orders, and then finally also contractual requirements. In terms of audit program planning, Generally, you want a list of risk-ranked auditable entities. You want to have established your audit frequency requirements. You want to understand the prior cycle that the facilities were on and when they were last audited. You want to understand what scheduling issues are with respect to those auditable entities, and also understand what your company emphasis programs are for the coming year. Outcomes of that audit planning process are going to be a list of entities to be audited, during the coming years, an audit schedule, identification of audit teams, and then also you need to think about a process to address changes that come up, like you've bought a new site, and that's going to come into the audit pool. You've sold some sites that were scheduled, and so that needs to be adjusted out of the schedule. The teams need to be reassigned. If we take this down and continue in a little bit more detail, we usually talk about two types of schedules in an audit program. One is the multi-year schedule. It covers from one audit to the next, so it covers a cycle. And it's usually done at kind of a generic level. It's just what businesses or sites are actually done in what year. So you could think of, say, a 3-year schedule, and the list of facilities that you have are put onto that schedule, but without respect to dates. When you get around to the current year, you take that current year and you develop it, and you put that out over the calendar. I'm going to do I've got 12 audits that I need to do. I'm doing one a month, and then you bring it down to when exactly are you going to be doing that in a given month. And then as you get those agreed with the sites, then you need to go on and get your teams assigned. So it's the lead auditor and the other auditors. When you're building the team, you need to think about, are you using internal or external auditors, or a combination? If you're using internal, sometimes people only want to use corporate staff when they do that. Sometimes they don't want to use corporate staff at all. They want it to be site-based personnel, and that's to promote cross-site learning. If you're using corporate auditors, sometimes these can be dedicated. That's all they do. There's an advantage to that in program design, but often it's not the case. So you're dealing with people who are non-dedicated, so they may do 1 or 2 audits a year, and the rest of the time they're doing other activities for the business. But what that means is that they're not going to be as aware of prior findings from other audits, and the consistency across the auditor base may not be as good as if you were using a dedicated pool. When you go to bring in external auditors, something to consider is if you're using certified auditors, or you're going to allow individuals who are not certified as auditors participate in the audit process. A lot of people want to use subject matter experts. That's good because they have a lot of knowledge. The drawback is sometimes the subject matter experts have not been trained in auditing. So they may know what is technically good, but they may not be as able to pull out gaps and identify shortcomings in programs because they're not used to doing that part of the work. You should also consider training programs with respect to your teams. Again, getting people actually trained in the skill of auditing is very important. So that would go for both auditors and lead auditors. And then you also need to train them in the specifics of your audit program, particularly if people are coming in from the outside so that they understand the nuances for your program. So a general audit process is shown on this slide. It's, again, pretty standard. You start out with planning. Once you get on site, you'll have an opening meeting, a facility tour usually. Then you get into your on-site review. Usually every day of active auditing, you'll do some kind of a debrief to keep the site up to date on how you're progressing through the audit schedule and what issues you're finding so that they become aware of it and they make sure that you've got all the information that you need in order to reach your conclusion of whether finding exists or not. Eventually, there's a closing meeting at the end of the on-site audit, and then you work to generate a final report. And then if the sites generate actions there's usually audit programs have some type of action verification at the end of it. One of the things that many of us had the opportunity to do during the pandemic was to essentially work on remote and hybrid audits. Now, these allowed us to continue our work at a time when we couldn't travel, and so it was new. And I think by and large, most people had success in developing them and then executing them. And what it really did is require a rethinking of the audit process, which allowed new tools to be incorporated into the audit process for auditors. And as the pandemic wanes, right, the role that these new approaches that we developed, how they're going to go forward in future audits, needs to be played out. I think the key thing is that they offer cost savings and in some instances better work product. Particularly, they can reduce the total cost of audit. A lot of that comes directly from reduction of travel costs associated with repositioning the auditors and keeping them out in the field. But my experience has shown that record review is generally done better remotely than on site if you have access to the same information set. And largely that's driven by the fact that if you're doing a record review off-site, you're not as apt to be distracted by all of the typical activities that go on in a meeting room if you're auditing on-site. Interviews, particularly if you're using the on-camera option, doing a remote audit are similar, and sometimes they can actually be better than if you're sitting there in person. And that's usually because the auditor is usually a little bit better prepared. Again, it's because you're not dealing with all of the ancillary activities that are ongoing during the site audit. Physical inspections are probably the biggest challenge that people brought up when we started to do these. We just wouldn't have the same effectiveness. One of the ways that we solved this in working with one of the clients that we work with is that we adopted a hybrid approach. So we had an on-site auditor that was from the local community on site for every remote audit that we did. And it required us to re-engineer the audit process a little bit so that the physical inspections that would normally be done for the topics that were being addressed by remote auditors were performed by the on-site auditor. So there was an information exchange that had to go on between the remote auditor and the on-site auditor, both in telling them what the physical inspections needed to be and then communicating the results back. The way that we did it, the sample set was chosen by the remote auditor, and the interpretation of the data coming back was done by the remote auditor. The on-site auditor just physically did the inspection and reported back the results. Another advance that I think it was there before the remote audits, or before the pandemic, but we really started to use it heavily during the pandemic. And this is, the aspects, the really productive aspects of file sharing and, more importantly, real-time multi-user authoring of single documents. This is where you can have an entire audit team working on a report simultaneously. If you're not using that in your audit programs, I would encourage you to take a look at it because it is a tremendous time saver. Having led many audits and dealt with pieces of in parts of audit reports coming at me in emails continuously during the audit, having it all there, really streamlines the process. You can provide feedback to the team. The team generally also benefits because they can see more, particularly junior members of the team can see more senior members of the team's work product as they're going through. And that is a great learning tool for them. And they can actually then begin to write better findings because they've got worked examples that they can look at when they're writing the report. When you get around to planning individual audits, some key things to think about are, again, the scope, which really defines your specific audit objective, right? It's very important to have a scope statement when you're doing an audit and making sure that that's agreed with the site, right? Because then you actually know what's inbounds and what's not, inbounds with respect to the audit. The way that I have always done audits is to work off an audit plan. So it basically details how the scope will be accomplished. We'll talk about a sampling strategy, a sampling and testing plan, and then ultimately both of those will lead to the daily audit schedule. We often talk about hierarchies in our audits. So we'll talk about a program, could be, for example, environmental. We'll talk about elements, an element or a topic could be waste, under the environmental, and then we'll have activities. And Sean will talk about that in more detail as we move through the presentation. Briefly, a sampling strategy, when I use the term, I'm talking about what program elements will be audited at which locations. So if you're doing a multi-unit, say a refinery, right, what elements are you going to be auditing at each one of those units? Generally, you don't have time to audit every element at every unit. And so you're making a choice, and that sampling strategy gives you that, it documents that choice. Those choices then leading to the sampling testing plans. And usually in a sampling testing plan is when you're working out what activities you're actually going to do when you're auditing those elements. And it kind of defines the what, and importantly, the activities define the how to audit. You'll talk about sample populations, how they're determined for each activity that you're looking at, and then getting auditors actually assigned into these activities. And again, all this flows to, what is a daily audit schedule. I highly recommend, any audit that you do has at least a topical audit schedule for each auditor. It laid out per day in time blocks, at least, to kind of give everybody an idea of what actually is going to be done and to make sure that you're allocating enough time to accomplish what it is that you need to. I've seen many people go into audits with an overly aggressive scope and content that they want to try to cover, and it's just impossible for auditors to execute it, right? So you really want to bring this all the way through to the daily audit schedule to make sure that you've got a reasonable amount of time for somebody to actually look at the topics that you're trying to decide whether you're in conformance or compliance with. And so the daily audit schedule, in my mind, implements the sampling and testing plan and a sampling strategy. It'll specify when and where a program element will be audited by a specific team member. And again, it basically demonstrates that you've got enough time or you're scheduling time for the auditors to complete, the tasks that they've been assigned. So this just gives you a very simple example of what a sampling testing strategy, a sampling strategy would look like. So if you got a multi-unit site, you got various topics, it's a checkerboard, right? But you just put, some X's to decide where you want to actually look at these various topics. So the sampling testing plan, again, we usually build it at the auditable activity level. So if you think about a program element activity, it's this level that we're scheduling in the plan. There's variable number of activities per element. Okay, so if you're auditing, waste as an element, and then a sub-element under that could be hazardous waste. Then there could be a set of activities under hazardous waste. When you're doing hazardous waste, what actually do you want auditors to look at, right? And then what are activities? If protocols, and you think about the commercial protocols that we typically get, if they're part of the what, right, which is, what is the actual requirement, then the activities that I'm talking about are part of the how, right? They're designed to provide additional instructions for how an auditor is to sample and test a given topic in order to gather the information needed to determine whether it conforms with the audit criteria or hence produces a finding of conformity or compliance. So I think of activities as the layer of detail under a protocol question. So if we pick a program, element and sub-element, if you want to develop activities under that, what I suggest is you include input from subject matter experts, experienced auditors, and line staff with responsibility for those activities. Gather your existing protocols gather your existing controls. These could be procedures, permits, training. Take the time to review and discuss so that you can identify the key activities for your situation. What's important for your business to make sure that the auditors are checking so that you can guarantee that your programs are robust with respect to those activities. What constitutes acceptable testing for an activity? Some things to consider are defining your control points. Does it capture the major risk driver? Defining failure of a control point. For example, the failure generates an unacceptable risk. Defining the system failure within a sample set. So when, if you are examining 10 things, how many failures of those 10 actually constitute something you want to be worried about, right? And that has implications for corrective actions as well. And we'll talk about that in more detail later. In a sampling testing plan, activities are generally assigned to auditors. They'll incorporate sample size considerations, realistic time allocations. I think of them as often as a mechanics estimates. So how long does it take for an activity to be performed for one member of the population? Then how many of the population are you testing? You got to compute the time you need to complete that activity then. And then this gets tailored based on experience. But the bottom line is, if it takes time, that time should be reflected on your daily audit schedule. And now I'm going to pass over to Sean to lead you through some more details on activities. Sean?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So for the next few slides, I'm going to provide an example activity-based approach that utilizes the concepts that Mike had just explained. So for example, using a generic audit topic that could commonly be found in either ESG or EHS audits, we might have an audit topic that is established to answer the question, is waste generated by the facility being appropriately managed? Building out the activity approach, we would first categorize the topic by program. So here it's an environmental program, and we're giving it the activity ID of P1. Next, we're defining the element category, which will identify as waste management. And we're assigning it the element code of E1 for the activity number. And then finally, we're going to further characterize this element into sub-elements of the waste management to one or more topics that represent the major activities associated with the waste management element. The first one we have here, so waste stream identification. Can't really do a lot if you don't have all of your waste streams appropriately identified. Then waste stream characterization. What type of waste is it? Is it recyclable material? Is it uniquely regulated? Waste storage. Does the waste require unique or specific storage, such as labeling, segregation, container types, inspections? Are there waste generation minimization opportunities, including landfill avoidance and beneficial reuse? Is the waste regulated for transport? If so, how do those regulations flow back to the generator and the facility? Then who are your partners that you're using to help manage waste? Are they participating in supply chain audits and scope 3 emissions reporting? Are they subject to DEI requirements? Is there a vetting process in place to qualify waste vendors? And then finally, for each sub-element, we will then break it apart into clearly defined auditable activities, which was the concept that Mike was just examining. So for our example, we're going to take S2, which is the waste characterization. For audit activity 1, we'd want to verify that waste characterizations are in fact documented. We're going to assume a sample size of 50 unique waste streams for the population size. And we're going to assign it a priority of a high. Using the table that we saw just before we jumped into this example, and that table was established for this particular audit. It can be dynamic, it can be changed, but the 50% sample size for a high priority audit activity equates to 25 sample size number. So essentially 25 waste streams we're going to perform an audit activity on, where we're going to verify that that waste stream is thoroughly documented at the facility. A second audit activity could be verification of the characterization or classification that was performed for each waste stream. which would likely include reviewing chemical laboratory data and or SDS reviews. Again, using the example population size of 50 waste streams and assigning this audit activity a medium risk, our sample size table then would have us do a 20% sampling strategy, which comes out to be about 10 individual waste streams that we'd want to review the characterization and classification data. Performing field observations of the actual processes that generate waste could be another audit activity. This may include reviewing process flow diagrams. And then as a final audit activity, reviewing waste reports that are in sustainability reports or regulatory reports against the gathered data just discussed. As Mike mentioned, this information is documented on a sampling and testing plan, which contains the information just discussed, but in a table format. And here we are also assigning auditors to activities and doing that calculation of total audit time per activity based on the sample sizes that we've determined, which are derived from their risk or priority placed on them through the audit program. And then lastly, we use the sampling and testing plan to create an audit schedule with assigned resources, both from the audit team and from the audited site, as well as daily breakdown of planned activities and other relevant data, including location and documents and records that are needed. And hopefully you can see that the benefits of this approach over a checklist style audits. Often we see checklist style audits that cover everything under the sun and with an equal weight as having the opposite effect, where business critical operations are sometimes missed since there simply isn't enough time to go through the entire checklist. Conversely, checklists that do not contain enough information on business processes and corporate and program risk inputs also tend not to yield a useful product, as they lack sufficient depth on business critical topics. This is in contrast to using this activities-based approach we just presented here, which does incorporate risk and priority. And that risk and priority can be obtained from both stakeholders and operational leaders to ultimately provide a more valuable and useful audit. From a planning standpoint, the pre-audit work to create the activities-based approach has the added benefit that the schedule may be dynamically changed with instant understanding of the effect on the audit and the ability to determine what activities can be trimmed or expanded on if more or less time is provided. And ultimately where we're going with this is the activity-based approach outlined here lends itself to examining the most important things that you want assurances on are correct in a clearly focused manner. These are often the things that perhaps keep the executive team up at night, or simply the things that have the most impact on our corporate goals. Mike, turn it back over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Sean. So now we've just taken you through some very detailed activities. And now what I want to switch gears to is to provide an opportunity for a little bit of balance. So if we simply look at this picture, focusing on the details, one might think that it actually represents a high-risk situation. However, if we step back a little bit and we look at broader information, you can see that perhaps our focus on the details really didn't describe the full risk profile for this situation. I had the opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, to work with the Institute of Internal Auditors, and I found that relationship to be very beneficial. They talk often about three lines of defense. The first line owns and manages the risks. The second oversees the risks. And the third is providing independent assurance of the risk. And I won't go into that in a lot of detail. I just want to mention it. If you do want more detail, you can look at the IIA's three lines model. Additionally, they put out a newsletter, and this one caught my eye. It was the February edition of Internal Auditor, and they talked about 5 attributes for auditors to consider when they're auditing. One is obviously the condition. What is the current state, right? So you're out there, you're looking, you're trying to determine what is, right? That's the current state. you need to understand what the criteria are that you're comparing to, right? This is what should be, right? One thing that they talk about in the article that people perhaps don't do as well as they could, it's to pick out the effect of, if somebody isn't doing what should be in the current state, what is the effect of that? So it's the so what part of the question, right? And that's important because you really want audit results to be meaningful, impactful, right? So the effect should be something that matters, right? It's not simply that they forgot to, put a comma or they left something that was not really a material risk out. You could point it out to them, but that's really not what we want you to go out there and find. We really want you to go find something that is important to the business, that when it's corrected, it will allow the business to succeed in a better fashion. They talk a lot about whys. Now, in standard EHS auditing, we don't have a lot of time as auditors to look at the whys. I'm going to talk a little about some things we can do, but that's something I think they spend more time on in internal audit. And it's good to read that article because I think it brings up several good points. And then finally, recommendations. So, their point, and I think we would agree with it, it's right, correct the root cause of the problem, not just the conditions. And again, so I refer you to their internal magazine, which is called Internal Auditor, the February 23 issue. So I'm going to move into what I call the powers of auditing controls, right? So what are controls? Controls are processes to provide reasonable assurance of compliance. They provide for direction of activities. They're concerned with prevention of undesirable events. They're concerned with mitigation of events with consequence. And also, what can a site do to detect nonconformances on its own, right? So why would we want to audit controls? Well, if we do that, we can obtain a higher assurance level, and we can allow for more focused risk assessment and management, ultimately leading to overall audit effectiveness being improved. When I talk about controls auditing, we usually talk about two different types of findings. One is a conformance point finding, which is a specific deviation or deviations from audit criteria. They're often, it's often a single thing that you've identified as wrong, and without any associated control context. It's just, hey, this is just not right. You got to fix it. But when we look at control findings, they're environmental aspects with no associated controls. They're a set of conformance point findings expressed in terms of the associated controls, indicating a failure in design of that control or a failure in its implementation. It could be what's missing in the control design and implementation that, if unaddressed, will lead to a conformance deviation or has already resulted in a conformance deviation. So if you want to address controls in an audit, what do you need to consider? From the planning part, it's to confirm your audit focus and resources, understanding what controls are in scope, and then making sure that you allocate time to sample and test those controls. Audit preparation, it's developing that understanding of the controls that are in the scope, right? What are the desired outcomes and the control objectives for the controls that have been established? Are they actually in place? And then, I think it's usually a very good idea to understand the nature of the control. Is it a preventive control? Is it a mitigative control? Is it a prescriptive or a directing control? Or is it one that enables self-assurance or detective? During, again, preparation, you want to make sure that you've got the controls have the proper design, that they're implemented per design, and they're actually sufficient to achieve the desired outcome or the control objectives. So a starting point is to request and review selected controls information during the pre-audit phase, factor the controls information into the on-site audit strategy. So in one of the ways that this can be done is after a typical audit finding is identified, the auditor should be asking what controls are in place to prevent this from reoccurring, what caused it for the control to fail, right? So you've detected some kind of non-conformance, which if a control was in place, right, was because the control didn't adequately prevent it from occurring. You're trying to understand that. And then you want to get the site to consider addressing this failure or lack of control in their CAPA plan. A critically important part of an audit is to determine what is a finding, right? So typical definition from, I think it's 19,011, the ISO standard, it basically results from a process that evaluates audit evidence and compares it against an audit criteria. It shows that an audit criteria is not met or nonconformity, right? One of the key things in auditing is to get auditors to make a good call on what is the difference between something that is a suggestion in prescriptive control and SOP and what is a requirement, right? A shall statement or a must statement is generally interpreted as that is a requirement that needs to be met. However, there's disagreement usually around what about the shoulds, okay? One of the best definitions I've heard around a should used in a control document like SOP is that they mean for it to be in place, but they realize that there could be exceptions when it doesn't make sense. So if you're not doing something that says should, then there should be a technical justification for why it's not being done. The most important thing from an audit perspective is to understand how that terminology is used and what it means within the constructs of the audit programs before you begin to write findings against something like that. The next thing is to document your findings, right? You really want to focus the finding on the point of nonconformance, and it needs to be written in a manner so that it's understood by the auditable entity, right? Whoever you're auditing. And what I always teach everybody is that you should write a finding so that it can stand the test of time. When you're in the midst of an audit, you understand all the context around what it is that's being written. But when you are looking at that finding a year or 2 years or 3 years later, you're not going to have all that context readily in your head. You have to read what was written in order to understand it. And often you're reading somebody else's work where you weren't associated with it at all. And so if you write something really well, it'll stand that, what I call that test of time. So typically it'll include a findings number, a citation, the relevant text of the citation, a finding statement really focused directly on the point of nonconformance, and then supporting information to explain in more detail what you've talked about in the finding statement. And then sometimes people will ask us to also provide corrective and preventive actions, which would be number, action, responsible parties, due dates. Management summaries are also useful. They're written really for management. They may include things like an executive summary, audit details and the processes used, and then importantly, program or topic area summaries. So a description of the key control documents that are implemented for that area, a description of responsibility within the program area, linkage to and context for the findings relevant to the program area, right? So you're just giving them a highlight of what was there, but providing more detail. Audit reports, who's writing them? Is it internal? Is it external? Is it the lead auditor? Thinking about due dates for the draft. Often when we do audits, we're providing at least a preliminary draft of the findings table to the site when we leave the audit. We'll have a due date established with the site for the final, so we keep on track, and we'll have a finalization process worked out with them. And again, thinking about the contents of the report, typically in more detail, we'll have some kind of management summary. There'll be a findings table, might be a separate opportunity for improvement table, and then also whether you're providing corrective or preventive actions or the site's doing that themselves. If you are dealing with preventive and corrective actions, basically guidelines, correct what was listed in the finding, identify whether other nonconformances exist within the related population. And if so, correct those nonconformances as well. A lot of people don't do this, and that leads to a series of repetitive findings until they finally actually fix all the nonconformances in the population. If a preventive action is viewed as necessary, generally you want to start with a risk-based root cause approach, where the level of rigor in your root cause increases as the risk of that finding increases. You want to formulate the preventive action to address the identified root cause. Once actions are determined, assign responsible parties and due dates, follow the actions through to completion. Okay. Audit programs should address how audit action verification will be performed. And again, risk-based considerations come into play. And then, if you're doing action verification, are you doing this between audits or are you doing it the next audit? If you're doing something annually, probably you could wait until the next audit to do it. Audit program evaluations, these are important parts of an overall audit process. You're basically evaluating how well the audit function is performing relative to expectations. You want to use various sources of information to design and assess design and performance. So, you might talk with stakeholders to get information on how the existing program is working. Informal evaluations of performance. Sometimes they'll do, internal quality checks. You want to review that kind of information. By doing these evaluations, it helps your program to maintain a high degree of credibility. So evaluation results and recommendations are generally reported to top management, and then you can get timely and complete follow-up on recommendations to demonstrate continuous improvement. So criteria that we've often used coming out of the certification body for the CPEA is something called BEAC, the Board of Environmental Auditor Certification Standards for the professional practice of auditing. It's a good standard set to use. The IIA Red Book, again, that's the International Professional Practices Framework, the IPPF. ISO 19011, which is Guidelines for Auditing Environmental Systems. There's an ASTM standard, E2107, which is Standard Practice for Environmental Regulatory Compliance. Consensus standard organizations can provide criteria. And then as well as looking at company audit programs, manual or procedure. If you're thinking about doing an evaluation of your program, we often recommend that you do an internal self-assessment first. Just find out where you are, because that will help direct what type of resources you actually need to bring in externally if you're looking for assistance. And so this is when you get into then, you could do an internal independent assessment, or you could do a third-party evaluation. You can also do like a peer evaluation as well in these types of assessments. When you're doing these, typically, we recommend that you don't do it, you do it at least every 5 years, right? Because if you're not, your program's really has a tendency to drift over time, and you're not really staying up to date on whether you're fulfilling all your requirements. This is something that I think with the pandemic, a lot of programs let this requirement slide. So a lot of programs perhaps actually need to take a look at this. And there's a lot of these new enhancements that we talked about earlier that came out in the pandemic that could be applied to really help organizations improve. So some parting thoughts. When you're planning audits, you want to be clear on the scope, the criteria, the plan, looking both at your sampling strategy, your sampling testing plan. I would encourage you to think about activity-based auditing. It's really auditing what's most important for your company, right? As opposed to trying to audit everything, which a lot of people try to do. right? Audit what is important. Daily audit schedule, make sure that you're giving people enough time to actually be able to tell you whether you're meeting your own criteria, right? And then think about what you want to do with the audit report, right? Who's it got to go to? What needs to be in it in order to benefit your company? So in my view, I spent a lot of time as a planning manager. To me, it's all in the planning, right? And to quote Stephen Covey, you always want to begin with the end in mind. With respect to controls auditing, I always like this phrase: if an organization has no controls, it has no control, right? Controls that are poorly designed and implemented may introduce unintended risk. Including an explicit controls assessment component in audits will add substantial value. Explicitly addressing controls in audits helps to focus CAPAs to improve the management process and system and not just address the symptoms of the underlying risk and problems. One of the most impactful presentations I ever had the opportunity to listen to use this phrase, and it's basically, as a leader, you get what you accept, right? So if you are thinking that your controls are actually working, right, and you're not checking them, you're accepting whatever status they're in. So I really encourage you, if you are relying on your controls to help make sure that your risk is managed, that you actually look at them during the course of your audits. And then with respect to audit evaluations, audit program evaluations, to return maximum value, your audit programs must be dynamic in design and practice. Your risks are going to shift over time. You need to make sure that your program shifts appropriately to address those. Audit programs must have a laser focus on efficiency and effectiveness, because without it, true performance will be hindered. Start with a good self-awareness of your own audit program if you're going to go down this road. A periodic audit of an audit program is an indicator of a leading edge, healthy program. It should be used to drive improvements. Audit program evaluations and associated follow-up should be leveraged as a means of identifying revolutionary, innovative opportunities. Any questions?
Well, thank you to Mike and Sean for giving us such a great overview of auditing. I really do wish we had more time today to jump into a Q&A session with our presenters, but we are almost at the top of the hour. Before we sign off for the day, though, I do want to ask one question for Mike and Sean. If an audit is defined as a planned event, can they be random? For example, surprise visits to a particular location to see workers behaving as they would without prior knowledge of an inspection activity.
Sean, I'll go ahead and take this one. That particular type of audit, which is a surprise audit, it can be done. It should be decided to be included as part of the audit program, so that your overall audit program strategy should include that. It shouldn't be a replacement for a normally scheduled audit, however, and I'll give you a specific example. If you wanted to, say, observe confined space entries as part of an audit, those are typically difficult to even schedule during a normal audit. If you do a surprise audit, you probably have less chance of walking in on one actually occurring. You might not be able to see that. So you could miss things that you would normally be able to check during a standard audit. So yes, they can be included, but they should be decided that you're going to include that type of activity at the audit program level.
And the only thing I would also add is that while the site may not necessarily be prepared or aware of it, there still can be a fairly substantial planning event that's happening at the corporate level or at the auditor's level. So they are planned events insofar as the auditors themselves have planned. It's just the site may be unaware of what's going to happen and when it's going to happen.
Got it. Thank you for adding that in, Sean. And with that, I think we are going to have to close up the event. I want to thank Montrose for organizing today's webinar. We look forward to, more questions coming in. Feel free, if we did not get a chance to answer your question, feel free to submit that in the follow-up survey that's going to pop up on your screen when I conclude today's event. But on behalf of the entire team at E+ELeader, thank you, Jamie, Mike, and Sean, for all the work you put into the presentation, as well as your team at Montrose for the work they do behind the scenes. So at this point, I'm going to conclude the webinar, and for all attendees who are watching live or on demand, please note that this event will be available on demand within the next 2 to 3 hours or so. So again, thank you for spending part of your day with us, and this concludes today's webinar.